Old money families don't just have more money than you. They think about money in a way that is fundamentally, structurally different from how the rest of us were taught to think. And the scariest part? Most of us will never figure that out. Not because we're not smart enough, not because we weren't born into it, but because nobody ever taught us the rules of a game that was designed to keep us out. That changes today. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is where we go deep on the wealth systems, the psychology, and the real frameworks behind generational money. Make sure you're subscribed because today's video is one of the most important ones we've done. Now, before we get into this, I need to make something very clear. When I say old money, I'm not talking about people who are just rich. I'm not talking about someone who built a successful business last decade. I'm not even talking about trust fund kids who blow through their inheritance on yachts and Instagram photo shoots. Old money, in the truest sense of the term, refers to families whose wealth has not just survived, but multiplied across multiple generations. We're talking 3, 4, 5 generations deep. Families like the Rothschilds, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Astors, old European aristocratic bloodlines, some of the old industrialist families in Asia. These aren't people who got lucky once. These are dynasties. And here's what makes them fascinating from a purely psychological standpoint. It's not the assets that keep them rich. Assets can be seized, lost in crashes, burned in wars, and historically, many of them were. What keeps these families rich, generation after generation, is a specific way of thinking about money, about time, about risk, about education, and about legacy. A mindset that is so deeply embedded in their culture and upbringing that it literally programs their children differently from birth. Today we're going to go through all of it, every major pillar of the old money mindset. And at the end, I'm going to show you exactly how to begin adopting these frameworks, regardless of what your family background looks like. This is going to be a long one, so get comfortable. Let's get into it. 1. They don't think in years. They think in decades and centuries. The very first and arguably most important pillar of the old money mindset is this: time horizon. Most people, and I include myself in the most people I was raised as, think about money in short cycles, monthly, yearly, maybe 5 years if you're really forward thinking. What am I earning right now? What can I afford this year? Can I buy that car before the end of the year? This is the financial psychology of the masses. And it's not because people are stupid, it's because most of us were raised in systems that rewarded short-term thinking. Paycheck cycles, annual performance reviews, consumer culture built entirely around immediate gratification. Old money families operate on a completely different time axis. When a Rockefeller patriarch made a business decision, he wasn't thinking about the next quarter. He was thinking about the next 40 years. When a Rothschild placed capital somewhere, they were asking, where will this be in a century? Not, what's the return this year? This isn't just a philosophical difference. It has enormous practical consequences. Think about compound interest. Albert Einstein reportedly called it the eighth wonder of the world. And the reason compound interest is so powerful is precisely because of time. $1 invested at 10% annual return becomes $2.59 in 10 years. But leave it for 60 years, and that dollar becomes $304. Same dollar, same rate. The only variable is time. Old money families have been letting money compound for generations. New money, and middle-class money, keeps interrupting the compound curve by spending it. Here's a real-world example of this. John D. Rockefeller established a family trust in the early 20th century, a trust specifically designed to preserve and grow wealth across generations. His instructions were explicit: don't spend the principal, ever. Only distribute the earnings, and establish systems that make it difficult for any one generation to liquidate the core assets. Today, over 100 years later, the Rockefeller Family Trust still exists and still functions. The original capital has compounded for over a century. Now compare that to the average lottery winner, and I keep coming back to this comparison because it's so stark. The average person who wins a $10 million jackpot will blow through it in 5 years. Not because they're bad people, not because they're careless people, but because they've been conditioned to think in short cycles. Suddenly, having $10 million doesn't change your time horizon. It just gives you more ammunition to spend in the short term. The old money mindset shift you need to absorb here is this: every financial decision you make today is an act of planting trees whose shade you may never sit under. But your children will. That's the mental frame. That's the operating system. When old money parents buy a property, they're not thinking about what they can sell it for in 5 years. They're thinking about whether their grandchildren will be glad they held it. When they invest in a business, they're not chasing the next hot IPO. They're looking for businesses with century-scale moats, things like real estate in prime locations, infrastructure, insurance, healthcare, things that will be needed in 50 years as much as they are needed today. The practical takeaway here, and I'll give you practical takeaways in every section, is this: start making at least one financial decision per year on a 25-year time horizon. Just one. It doesn't have to be huge. It could be a retirement account contribution, a small land purchase, a life insurance policy for your children, something. Start programming your brain to think generationally, even if just one decision at a time. 2. They own assets. They don't chase income. The second major pillar of the old money mindset is perhaps the most misunderstood one, and it's the one that most directly explains why the rich keep getting richer while everyone else stays on the hamster wheel. Old money doesn't chase income. Old money builds and holds assets. Now, what's the difference? Because on the surface, they sound similar. Income is money that flows to you. Assets are things you own. But here's the critical distinction. Income stops when you stop working. Assets keep generating income whether you're working or not. The middle class has been programmed to think in terms of income. Get a good job, earn a good salary, work your way up, get promotions, maximize your W-2. This is the path, and it's not a terrible path for survival, but it is fundamentally incompatible with the old money philosophy, because a salary, no matter how large, is still fundamentally your time being exchanged for money, and time is the one resource that is completely finite and completely non-renewable. Old money families own assets, land, buildings, businesses, art, intellectual property, financial instruments, and most critically, they own them across generations. The Astors built their fortune initially on fur trading, but what kept them rich for generations was real estate. At one point, the Astor family owned an estimated 1/15 of all the real estate in New York City. Not stocks they could sell in a panic. Physical land in the most valuable city in the Western world. Land that appreciates. Land that generates rent. Land that can be passed down. Let me give you the math on why this matters so much. Imagine 2 people. Person A earns $300,000 a year as a doctor or lawyer. Person B owns a portfolio of properties worth $3 million that generates $180,000 a year in passive income. On the surface, Person A earns more. But here's the truth. Person A's wealth creation stops the second they stop working. Injury, illness, burnout, a bad economy, and the income goes away. Person B can be sitting on a beach, sick in a hospital, or literally asleep, and the income keeps flowing. And here's the kicker. Person B's $3 million asset base is also appreciating. So, 20 years from now, that portfolio might be worth $9 million and generating $540,000 a year. Person A, at the end of their career, might have a 401k and some savings. Person B has built a dynasty. Old money families understand this distinction on an almost cellular level. It's baked into how they talk to their children about money from a very young age. They don't say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" as a career question. They say, "What do you want to own when you grow up?" The framing is fundamentally different. This also explains why old money families are often not the flashiest people in the room. You'll rarely see a truly old money family driving the newest luxury car or wearing logo-covered designer clothing. That's a new money signal, the desire to show wealth. Old money families have nothing to prove. Their wealth isn't in the car, it's in the asset column. The quieter the lifestyle, the more of the return gets reinvested into assets. The concept of stealth wealth is a real and deliberate strategy among old money families. Spending conspicuously is a tax on wealth accumulation. Every dollar spent on a luxury item that depreciates is a dollar that isn't compounding in an asset. Practical takeaway: stop asking, "How do I earn more?" Start asking, "How do I own more?" Even at a small scale, a rental property, a dividend-paying stock portfolio, a small business you own a stake in, the vehicle matters less than the mental shift from income chasing to asset building. 3. Education is not a degree. It's a system. Here's something that might make some people uncomfortable. Old money families do not actually revere formal education the way the middle class does. Wait, before you click away, hear me out. This is deeply counterintuitive because we've all been told that education is the path to success. Get good grades, get into a good college, get a degree, get a job, and that is a valid path for professional employment. But old money families are not optimizing for employment. They're optimizing for ownership. And those two goals require completely different educational frameworks. The middle class treats education as a certification system. You earn a degree, and the degree signals to employers that you're qualified to work for them. The whole framework is built around making you a better, more valuable employee. Old money treats education as a power system. They educate their children to understand how the world actually works, how money flows, how legal systems operate, how to negotiate, how to read people, how to build and maintain networks, how to lead, how to communicate with authority. Not to get a job, to own, control, and expand inherited power. Let me give you some concrete examples of how this plays out. In many old money families, children are exposed to legal and financial concepts from a very young age, not in a textbook way, in a dinner table conversation way. A father who runs a family business will talk to his 12-year-old about why they structured a deal a certain way. A grandmother who manages the family trust will explain to her grandchildren what a fiduciary duty is and why it matters. These conversations happen naturally, constantly, Because the children are surrounded by adults who live this language every day. There's also a major difference in what old money considers valuable knowledge. While the middle class prizes technical skills, coding, engineering, medicine, law as a profession, old money prizes what we might call meta skills. Skills about skills. Things like how to evaluate the credibility of information, how to identify good advisors versus bad ones, how to structure agreements so they protect your interests, how to read financial statements not just to understand a business, but to understand power, how to sit across from someone in a negotiation and not flinch. These are skills that compound just like money does, and they're almost impossible to learn in a traditional classroom. Old money families also have a very specific relationship with failure as a teacher. Because their financial survival doesn't depend on any single endeavor, they can afford to let their children fail in controlled environments and learn from it. Middle-class parents, often terrified of failure because a mistake could mean real financial hardship, tend to overprotect. Old money parents tend to say, "You lost that money? Good. What did you learn?" The lesson is more valuable than the capital lost. This is why you see so many old money scions starting businesses, often poorly in their early 20s, and being supported through the failure. Not because the family is funding recklessness, but because they know that the education gained from a failed business venture at 23 is worth more than any MBA you can buy. Practical takeaway: you don't need to be old money to begin educating yourself and your children this way. Start having money conversations at the dinner table. Read books about financial systems, not just personal finance tips. Study history through the lens of how wealth moved and transferred. And, most importantly, learn how legal structures work. A basic understanding of trusts, LLCs, and contracts is worth more than almost any other financial knowledge you can acquire. Hey, quick pause here, because we're about halfway through, and I want to make sure you're getting everything from this video. If this is the kind of content that you want more of, the deep dives into wealth psychology, generational money, the systems behind the systems, make sure you hit subscribe and drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps me know what you want more of. And leave a comment below. I want to know, which of these mindset shifts are you going to start implementing first? All right, back to it, because the next section is one of the most important ones we haven't talked about yet. 4. The network is the net worth. There's a cliche you've probably heard 1,000 times. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And the first time you hear it, it sounds a little cynical, like an excuse for nepotism. But when you understand how old money actually operates, you realize this phrase barely scratches the surface of the truth. Old money families don't just have networks, they have ecosystems. Multi-generational, carefully cultivated webs of relationships that span industries, geographies, governments, and institutions. And these ecosystems don't happen by accident. They are deliberately built and maintained over generations as a core wealth strategy. Let me explain how this works in practice. When an old money family sends their child to a prestigious boarding school, not just an academically excellent school, but a specific school with a specific social makeup, they are not primarily paying for education. They are paying for the relationships their child will form. The child who sits next to your son at Eton or Andover, or the Lycée Henri IV today, might be running a major financial institution, a government ministry, or a multinational corporation in 30 years. And when that happens, your son will pick up the phone, not as a cold call, but as someone who shared a dormitory with that person. That's not nepotism. That's strategic relationship infrastructure that was built decades in advance. But it goes even deeper than school connections. Old money families maintain their networks through what we might call social rituals of reciprocity, country clubs, private societies, charitable foundations, family offices, annual gatherings. These aren't just social activities, they are infrastructure for the maintenance and expansion of power networks. Every handshake at a charity gala is a maintenance touchpoint on a relationship that might have been started by the previous generation. Every favor done is a credit in a ledger that will be called in somewhere down the line. The concept of social capital, the value embedded in relationships, is as real and as manageable as financial capital to old money families. And just like financial capital, it must be invested, maintained, and protected. Old money parents teach their children to write thank you notes, not as a formality, but as a system for relationship maintenance. They teach them how to listen, how to make people feel important, how to navigate social hierarchies with grace. These are wealth skills, because relationships at the highest levels of society are literally worth millions of dollars. There's also something very important about the quality of advisors in the old money ecosystem. Wealthy families don't use a general financial advisor from a chain firm. They have private wealth managers who have worked with their family for decades, family lawyers who know every trust, every asset, every legal structure, accountants who understand the full complexity of their wealth picture. These advisors are often multi-generational themselves. The current wealth manager might be the son of the advisor who served the grandfather. This continuity of expert counsel is a massive competitive advantage that most people never even consider. Think about it. A regular person making a major financial decision, buying a property, starting a business, has to start from scratch finding advice. They Google it, they ask a friend. Maybe they hire a professional they've never worked with before. An old money family making the same decision calls people who have been working for them for 30 years, who understand the full context of their wealth, who have seen every mistake they've ever made, and who have a long-term relationship and reputation on the line. The quality of decisions made with that kind of advisory infrastructure is categorically different. Practical takeaway: you don't need to go to Eton to build a powerful network, but you do need to be intentional. Join organizations where ambitious, successful people gather. Give value before you ask for anything. Maintain relationships with genuine consistency, not just when you need something. And start thinking about your professional relationships as long-term assets that require investment and maintenance. 5. They have a completely different relationship with debt and risk. This is the section that tends to blow people's minds the most, because what I'm about to tell you runs completely counter to almost everything we've been taught about debt and risk. Most middle-class financial advice says debt is bad, avoid it, pay it off. Dave Ramsey built an empire telling people to cut up their credit cards and pay off their mortgages. And for the middle class, where debt is typically consumer debt used to buy things that depreciate, this is genuinely good advice. But old money families have an entirely different philosophy on debt. They use it as a lever for wealth amplification. Not to consume, to acquire. Here's the fundamental distinction. Bad debt buys liabilities. Good debt buys assets that outperform the cost of the debt. Old money families never touch the first kind. They are extraordinarily sophisticated users of the second. Let's say you have the opportunity to acquire a commercial property worth $5 million in a prime location. You expect it to generate $350,000 per year in rent and appreciate at 5% per year. You could pay cash, but that would tie up $5 million of capital that could otherwise be deployed elsewhere. Or you could borrow $4 million at 4% annual interest, which costs you $160,000 per year, and only deploy $1 million of your own capital. Now your $1 million is generating the same $350,000 in rent. You're paying $160,000 in interest and netting $190,000, a 19% cash-on-cash return on your actual deployed capital, plus the asset appreciation. Old money families understand this lever intuitively. This is why the wealthiest families often have enormous amounts of debt, not as a sign of financial distress, but as a sign of sophisticated asset acquisition. The Rockefellers used leverage. The Rothschilds built their banking empire partly on understanding credit as a tool of power. Major real estate dynasties like the Trumps, before the later career disasters, built portfolios through strategic use of leveraged debt. But old money also has a deeply counterintuitive approach to risk that separates them from new money and from the middle class. Middle-class thinking sees risk as something to be avoided. Play it safe. Don't risk what you can't afford to lose. Risk is frightening because for most people, a significant financial loss could genuinely threaten their security. Old money thinking sees risk as something to be managed, understood, and selectively embraced, not because they don't care about losing money, but because they have the time horizon, the diversification, and the financial resilience to absorb losses that would be catastrophic for the average person. When a Rothschild-era banker made a risky loan to a sovereign government, they weren't being reckless. They had done the analysis. They understood the political landscape. They had relationships with the power structures involved. And even if the bet went wrong, it wouldn't wipe out the family, because the family wealth was spread across dozens of different asset classes in multiple countries. The loss would sting. It would not kill them. This is the concept of asymmetric risk, making bets where the upside is far larger than the downside, and where the downside is cushioned by diversification. And it requires two things that only come with generational wealth: time and diversification. You can't play asymmetric risk if one bad bet means you can't pay your rent. But if you've been building diversified assets for decades, you can afford to swing at high-reward opportunities. Old money also has a very different relationship with insurance, both literal insurance. They have extremely sophisticated insurance strategies involving private trusts and self-insurance mechanisms, and metaphorical insurance in the form of diversification. They never put all their eggs in one basket, not even one sector of baskets. Their eggs are in real estate, in equities, in private businesses, in art and collectibles, in bonds, in cash, in foreign assets. The goal isn't maximum return, it's maximum survival, so that the next generation inherits a living, growing organism. Practical takeaway: begin thinking about debt in two categories: consuming debt, bad, avoid, and investing debt, managed carefully, can be powerful. And begin building a risk buffer, an emergency fund large enough to let you take calculated risks without those risks threatening your basic security. You can't play offense until you've secured your defense. 6. Emotional discipline, the invisible superpower. We've covered time horizons, asset building, education systems, networks, debt and risk. But there's one pillar of the old money mindset that underpins all of the others, and it's the one that nobody ever talks about. Emotional discipline around money. This is one of the most significant and consistent differences between families that build generational wealth and those that don't. It's not intelligence, it's not luck, it's not even strategy. It's the ability to remove emotion from financial decision-making and to make rational, patient, long-horizon choices even when everything around you is screaming to do the opposite. Think about 2008, the global financial crisis, markets collapsing, banks failing, pensions being wiped out. The emotional, fear-driven response, the one that millions of middle-class investors made, was to sell everything, get out, stop the bleeding. And that emotional response, in many cases, turned a temporary paper loss into a permanent, real loss. Because the people who sold at the bottom missed the recovery. And the recovery between 2009 and 2019 was one of the greatest bull markets in history. Old money families, almost without exception, bought in 2008 and 2009. Not because they had a crystal ball, but because their emotional detachment from short-term fear allowed them to see clearly what was happening. A temporary mispricing of assets, and they had the financial resilience and the emotional discipline to act on that clarity while everyone else was panicking. This emotional discipline is cultivated from childhood. Old money children are not raised in households where money is a source of anxiety. Scarcity mindset, the constant background hum of financial fear that shapes most middle-class psychological relationships with money, is simply absent in these environments. This doesn't mean they don't take money seriously. It means they approach it from a position of calm, rational power, rather than from a position of fear. There's profound research from the field of behavioral economics that supports this. Daniel Kahneman's work on loss aversion shows that the psychological pain of losing $1,000 is roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining $1,000. This asymmetry of emotional response causes most people to make systematically irrational financial decisions, holding losing positions too long, selling winning positions too early, avoiding good opportunities because they might go wrong. Old money culture, through multi-generational wealth, largely bypasses this psychological trap. When you don't need the money to survive, you can think clearly about what the money should do. This is also why old money families are notoriously patient investors. They will hold a position for decades, not because they're passive, but because they've done the analysis. They believe in the long-term value, and they have the emotional discipline not to react to short-term noise. Warren Buffett, arguably the most famous practitioner of this philosophy, is fond of saying his favorite holding period is forever. He learned this from the Benjamin Graham tradition, but it mirrors exactly the old money approach. The emotional discipline also extends to the way old money talks about, and even thinks about money. In old money culture, there is often a strong social prohibition against ostentatious displays of wealth or money talk at social gatherings. This isn't just taste, it's a cognitive strategy. By not constantly talking about, celebrating, or emotionally engaging with wealth, they prevent the kind of ego attachment that leads to reckless decision-making. The money is a tool, not an identity. Practical. Takeaway. Begin to audit your emotional relationship with money. Do you make financial decisions from a place of fear or from a place of rational analysis? Start a practice of delaying major financial decisions by 48 hours to let emotion subside. and work deliberately on building a financial cushion large enough to reduce the anxiety that drives bad decisions. 7. The legacy architecture, how they build systems that outlive them. We've been talking about mindsets and philosophies, but old money doesn't just think differently. They build differently. Specifically, they build systems, structures, and vehicles specifically designed to transfer and protect wealth across generations. And understanding these systems is crucial, not just as information, but as inspiration for what you can begin to build, even at a small scale. The most important of these structures is the family trust. A trust is a legal entity that holds assets, not in your name, but in the name of the trust itself. This distinction is enormously important for two reasons. First, because assets held in a trust are generally protected from creditors, lawsuits, and the kind of catastrophic financial events that can wipe out personally held wealth. Second, because a trust survives death. When an individual dies, their personally held assets go through probate, a legal process that is often slow, expensive, and public. Trust assets bypass probate entirely and transfer seamlessly to the next generation, according to the terms the original grantor set. Old money families have been using trusts for centuries. The mechanism allows them to essentially pre-program the rules of wealth transfer across generations. A trust can specify that beneficiaries don't receive principal until a certain age. It can require that beneficiaries demonstrate financial literacy before accessing funds. It can establish conditions that incentivize the behaviors the founding family wanted to perpetuate. Education, professional achievement, entrepreneurship. It's wealth transfer with instructions attached. Beyond trusts, old money families often have family offices, essentially private financial management firms that exist solely to manage the family's wealth. A family office handles investment management, tax strategy, estate planning, philanthropy, legal compliance, and often family governance, setting rules for how the family makes collective decisions about the shared wealth. Family offices are typically only economically viable for families with over $100 million in assets, but the concept behind them that you need dedicated specialized infrastructure to manage and grow wealth is scalable at any level. At a smaller scale, what a family office looks like is having a regular family meeting about finances, having a clear estate plan, having deliberate conversations about how wealth will be transferred and under what conditions, having trusted advisors who understand your full financial picture. None of this requires being a billionaire. It requires being intentional. Old money families also use sophisticated tax strategies as a core component of wealth preservation. This isn't tax evasion. It's the sophisticated use of legal tax structures. Charitable foundations, which also double as networking infrastructure and tax shields, which we'll cover in a separate video. Conservation easements, qualified opportunity zone investments, grantor-retained annuity trusts, strategic charitable giving. These strategies, when used together, can dramatically reduce the tax drag on generational wealth transfer. A family that transfers $10 million at a 40% estate tax rate loses $4 million to the government. A family that has spent 10 years legally structuring that same transfer through trusts and charitable vehicles might transfer $9.5 million. That $5.5 million difference, compounded over the next generation, is worth dramatically more. And finally, old money families understand and obsessively practice the separation of business risk from family wealth. They never commingle the family's core wealth with individual business ventures. Businesses are held in separate legal entities, LLCs, corporations, partnerships, that limit liability to the assets inside that entity. If a business fails, it fails. The core family wealth, held in separate trust structures, is untouched. This structural separation is one of the most important pieces of architecture in the old money system, and it's something that many new money families catastrophically neglect. Practical takeaway: even if you're just starting out, begin building the architecture. Write a will today if you haven't already. Look into setting up a basic trust structure with an estate attorney. Open accounts in your children's names. Separate your business and personal finances with proper legal entities. Start building the infrastructure now, even if the wealth it's designed to protect is still growing. 8. The mindset shift. Nobody talks about seeing yourself as a steward, not an owner. This is the last major section, and in some ways, it's the most profound. It's not about strategies or structures or systems. It's about a fundamental philosophical reframe of what it means to have wealth. Middle-class culture and much of new money culture sees wealth through a lens of ownership and personal consumption. The money is mine. I worked for it. I earned it. I deserve to enjoy it. What can I get with this? This is a completely understandable and very human orientation toward money, but it is fundamentally incompatible with generational wealth. Old money families, almost universally, see themselves as stewards of their wealth, not owners. The wealth isn't theirs to consume. They are temporarily the caretakers of something much larger than themselves, something that existed before they were born and that is expected to exist long after they die. Their job is not to enjoy the wealth and pass down whatever is left. Their job is to grow the wealth, protect it, and pass down a larger, better structured version of it to their children, who will then be the stewards for their children. This stewardship mentality changes everything about how you interact with money. If the money is yours to consume, every luxury purchase feels justified. You earned it. If the money is in your stewardship, every luxury purchase requires justification. Is this the best use of the family's resources? The former mindset depletes wealth. The latter preserves and grows it. You see this stewardship mindset expressed in old money culture in many ways. In the meticulous care of family properties, estates that have been maintained for a century, not because they can't afford to renovate, but because they feel a responsibility to preserve them. In the emphasis on family name and reputation, because the family's reputation is itself a form of capital that must be protected and passed down intact. In the reluctance to make flashy investments or chase trends, because the steward's job is capital preservation first, growth second, consumption last. The Vanderbilts are a fascinating and instructive cautionary tale here. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the patriarch, built one of the greatest fortunes in American history through railroads and shipping. But the culture he instilled did not fully embrace the stewardship mentality. Several of his heirs were extravagant consumers, building enormous cottages, actually enormous mansions, in Newport, Rhode Island, throwing legendary parties, living in the grandest possible style. Within 2 generations, much of the fortune had been dissipated. By the 3rd generation, some Vanderbilt heirs were struggling. By the 1970s, a Vanderbilt family reunion reportedly didn't include a single millionaire among the 40-plus attendees. The money lasted roughly 50 years. Compare that to families with a stewardship culture who are still wealthy after 300 years. The shift from owner to steward isn't just about wealth, by the way. It's about your relationship with everything you create: your business, your reputation, your community, your family culture. Old money families think of all of these as legacies to be curated and passed forward, not possessions to be used up and discarded. Practical takeaway: try journaling this question. If I imagine myself as the steward of my family's financial future, not the owner of money I earned, what financial decisions would I make differently? The answers to that question are probably the most important financial lessons you'll ever write down. How to start adopting this mindset. Now, all right, we've covered a lot of ground, and I know what some of you are thinking. This is fascinating, but I wasn't born into old money. I don't have a trust fund or an ancestral estate. What do I actually do with any of this? That's the right question. And here's the truth. You don't need to be old money to think like old money. The mindset is transferable. It just requires deliberate, intentional practice, especially if you were raised in an environment that programmed you to think the opposite way. Here's your practical roadmap, broken down into immediate, medium-term, and long-term actions. First, write a will. If you don't have one, you don't have a wealth plan. Full stop. Second, sit down and list all of your assets and all of your debts. Categorize your debts: consuming or investing. Third, identify one time horizon decision you can make on a 25-year frame. A retirement contribution, a small investment account for your child. Something that forces your brain into generational thinking mode. Next 3 to 12 months. Meet with an estate planning attorney. Even if you don't have much yet, building the legal infrastructure early is dramatically cheaper and easier than trying to do it later when things are more complex. Begin deliberately building one high-quality, long-term professional relationship each quarter. Identify a mentor or advisor who thinks in the time horizons you want to think in. Start converting consuming habits into investing habits, even small ones. Instead of buying a new phone at full retail, put that $800 into a dividend-paying asset. The amount matters less than the habit. Long-term, multi-year. Begin having deliberate financial culture conversations in your household. If you have children, start teaching them about money the old money way. Not rules about saving, but concepts about assets, time, and stewardship. Work toward building an emergency fund large enough to let you make decisions from a position of confidence rather than fear, and begin thinking seriously about what you want to leave. Not just financially, but in terms of habits, networks, values, and knowledge. That's the real inheritance. The old money mindset isn't a set of tricks or hacks. It's a complete operating system for how you see yourself in relation to money, time, and legacy. And the most powerful thing I can tell you about it is this: it's learnable. The families who have wealth today that stretches back centuries, many of them didn't start with money. They started with a mindset, and then they built the money around it. You can do the same thing. Maybe not in your lifetime, maybe not even in your children's lifetime, but you can be the person who starts the dynasty, the one who makes the decisions, builds the infrastructure, and instills the culture that your descendants will look back on and say, "Well, that's where it began." If this video added real value to your understanding of wealth and how it actually works, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we go deep on this stuff every week. And leave a comment. Tell me which section hit hardest for you. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next one.